Hi, I'm David Gord of Mother Jones Magazine, and like many of you, I've been wondering what's going on in Yemen, what's happening with the Houthis. We have a whole new war brewing as we're dealing with conflict in Gaza, in Syria, in Lebanon, and of course in Ukraine. So we have with us today Matt Duss. He is the Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy and a former foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. So Matt, thank you for joining us.
Very glad to. Thank you, David.
You're an expert in these areas. Can you first start off by just giving us a very short and basic description of who the Houthis are and why they're lobbing missiles at ships and other targets in the Middle East?
Sure. So I'll try to give the short version here. I mean, Yemen has a very long history, thousands of years of civilization. But I think for our purposes, we can go back to 1990, which is when there was a 4-year civil war between what was then North and South Yemen. Yemen was reunified under the leadership of a president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who ended up being president for some over 20 years. But that was, a government that was, genuinely undemocratic, corrupt, and you still had a lot of unrest in other regions of Yemen that were not receiving services, that were not receiving the support that they needed or representation. And one of those areas was northern Yemen, which is where the Houthi movement started. And they're called the Houthis because of one of their leaders, who was kind of the main ideologue of the movement. They are Shiite Muslims. They are part of a very small sect called Zaydi Shiites. So that's part of it. But again, that religious distinction is important, but it's also important to note, as is often the case, this is a political movement. The drivers here are political. They felt oppressed. They were not receiving representation in the government. And they also kind of arose in response to efforts by Saudi Arabia to impose the Saudi Wahhabi kind of vision of Sunni Islam in Yemen and in the region, which is something the Saudis had done for decades.
We hear that, again and again, they're Iranian-backed. Now, how important is that? Is that, are they proxies? Or as you seem to suggest, they have an independent, indigenous beef, such as it is?
Well, as is often the case, it's both. I mean, they are an indigenous movement representing indigenous concerns, but Iran, as Iran has shown it's very capable and adept at doing, it will, use these opportunities to build relationships with groups across the region. And I want to say here, as I've said in the past, Iran has shown itself to be very effective at exploiting the huge blunders of its adversaries. And it has been very fortunate in having adversaries that continue to make these enormous blunders, whether you're talking about Israel in Lebanon, which created the opportunity to really strengthen a relationship with Hezbollah, effectively help create Hezbollah and forge that into one of the key strategic relationships Iran has, whether it's the United States invasion of Iraq, which enabled Iran to, essentially move in with some of its organizations that were literally founded in Iran for the purpose of creating revolution in Iraq. And then in the Saudi UAE invasion that began in 2015. So that has enabled Iran to kind of build these relationships and create what is called strategic depth, which is the ability to kind of defend your country farther away from the borders. It gives them, levers they can pull to create pain. And their adversaries know that they can pull these levers, which is a disincentive to screwing with them.
So if I understand correctly, the civil war, the recent civil war in Yemen, has basically come to a kind of unsettled end, but more or less an end. And there's been peace talks between the Houthis and Saudis and others. And the Houthis, in essence, seem to have won, more or less. So why then are they now attacking ships in the shipping lane and also Saudi targets, oil refineries, and striking at other Middle Eastern or regional nations? Why are they doing this?
I think, things have always been kind of on a tightrope here. But I think part of what we have to understand is that the Houthis now essentially more or less governing were facing a lot of unrest on their own because they're doing a very bad job at governing. And as is often the case, these ineffective governments seek to kind of externalize their domestic problems. And that is what the Gaza war gave them an opportunity to do, to kind of retake the mantle of resistance against the American and Israeli, forces by attacking shipping and saying they are protesting on behalf of the people of Gaza. And that has in some ways been very effective. I mean, we shouldn't pretend that the Houthis are heroes here, but they have, I think, effectively, in the eyes of many in the region and across the world, shown themselves to be effective in protesting and bringing the global economy, if not to a halt.
So the U.S. and Biden, as you noted, had been involved with diplomacy in Yemen to try to, ease up, end this civil war and get a peaceful peace settlement. But now they've had 7, 8, whatever it been. There were just last night more strikes against Yemen. Is this the right thing to be trying or not to be doing?
I mean, in my view, they should be going to the source of this, which is the Gaza war. I mean, clearly, Houthis or anyone attacking shipping is something we need to be very, very concerned about. But just because the Houthis are an authoritarian extremist group doesn't mean they're wrong about the Gaza, catastrophe.
But in terms of just trying to stop this, the pressure and the attacks they're putting on shipping and other targets, is this the right or wrong course for Biden?
I think it's the wrong course. I think there is a danger here. I mean, the Biden administration's priorities here, have been twofold. One is they're just going to back the Israelis essentially unconditionally in their response to October 7. And again, of course, no one disagrees that they have the right to respond to the atrocities on October 7. Any country would. The way they respond, as the Biden administration will say, matters. But of course, their actions have shown that they're not really going to do much about it. But at the same time, they've also been very, very, emphatic to other countries in the region about trying to contain the fighting within Gaza. And I think that is clearly failing. I mean, I don't think Iran or others really want an escalation. I think everyone in the region understands that if this thing gets out of control, it will be absolutely horrible region-wide and globally. I often think, when the question of military intervention comes up, I try to pose a few questions. One, have you exhausted non-military options? I don't think they have. Are you acting within a kind of global, international consensus? And I think the relatively small coalition, the US, UK, and a few other countries that are actually engaged here shows that they are not. As much as everyone would agree that, yes, we don't want ships harassed in the Red Sea and impacting global trade, I think the relative lack of outright support we're seeing is telling. And the last and just as important is, are you acting with appropriate congressional authority? Like American domestic legal authority. And this is where I have very serious questions. Again, this was the basis for the War Powers Resolution that Senator Sanders introduced. It was the first War Powers Resolution that was passed in American history to use the first, resolution to use these tools by saying that the Trump administration was engaged in hostilities as defined in the 1973 statute, 1973 law, and had not sought appropriate authorization from Congress. And I think we are in a very similar situation. It is not as egregious, I think, as the Trump administration's support for the Saudi war, which was refueling, arming, targeting intelligence, a whole range of things. But it is clear that we're bombing Yemen.
Assuming we can't stop Israel from bombing Gaza in the way it has immediately, then should the United States and Canada, UK, Holland, and one or two other countries, should they then do nothing with the attacks that the Houthis are mounting? Can you even have a conversation with the Houthis or with Iran? Do you let the attacks go on? Is there another action, diplomatic action, that one can at least attempt?
I think there is number 2 and 3, which is seeking international support, like real international legal support. Again, the UN is dysfunctional in so many ways, but that doesn't mean you give it a try. And the last is coming to Congress. They have made war powers reports to Congress. I think there's increasing numbers of members of Congress such as Congresswoman Jayapal, Congressman Ro Khanna, and others who've been leaders on these issues, who have said the president is empowered to use military force without notifying Congress under very specific circumstances, such as an emergency and an attack or an imminent attack on U.S. territory or persons. The administration was signaling these attacks for weeks. They had more than enough time to seek actual authorization for the use of military force. They have chosen not to do that. Now, they will say that they've engaged with Congress, they've informed Congress. I don't think that meets the standard of the law, and I think there are members of Congress who feel the same way. So I think that's the step they need to take.
But if they got Congress to support this, if they came to Congress, would you think that was still the right course? I mean, the actual attacks or the type of attacks they're mounting would be the right way to proceed here?
I think that debate would force them to tell, the Congress and the world, okay, what are you trying to achieve here? Because as you said, what they're trying to do is just, we're just trying to degrade their capability. We're not going to stop these. As the president kind of famously said a few days ago, do you think these attacks will stop the Houthis? No. Will they continue? Yes. They're just trying to degrade them. But ultimately, I hear that answer and it chilled me a bit, because this is kind of a similar approach we saw the Israelis taking to Gaza for years and years. They called it mowing the lawn. We know that we're not going to stop these rocket attacks. We're going to maybe pause them. We're going to degrade their abilities by bombing them every once in a while. But the problem just ultimately gets worse and worse. And at some point, it explodes in ways you cannot predict. And that is my real concern here. I want to say one other thing, too. I mean, you talked about Iran, and I think Iran is a key factor here. Not because, the Houthis are just a tool of Iran. I think it's wrong to treat the Houthis as simply an instrument. Yes, there is a relationship. Yes, the war, the Saudi war that the U.S. supported, created an opportunity for the Iranians to deepen that relationship in a big way. But let's remember the Biden administration, President Biden got elected having committed to returning to the Iran nuclear agreement that Trump withdrew from. That he was a pretty unequivocal commitment, and he surprised a lot of us by taking office and then kind of slow walking that diplomacy. And I said at the time, many said at the time, and I think it's incontrovertible now, that was a big mistake. I mean, I think there was an opportunity and a much more sympathetic and supportive government in Iran to rejoin that agreement and get to a point where we at least had, if not a good relationship with Iran, a channel to Iran, a conversation with Iran to deal with some of these broader regional issues. We just don't have that now. Now, I'm not pretending that if only Biden had made a different choice, then things would be great with Iran. I mean, it's possible it wouldn't have worked. I'm just saying part of my, regret here is we will never know. Because Biden chose to do something different than what he said he was going to do. So I think it's worth taking that into account as well.
Yeah, and I think ultimately the primary concern here is the conflict just spreading everywhere. And the one thing we know about warfare in general is that predictions often don't hold true. And each of these new episodes seems to be lighting another match and hoping you'll get lucky.
Yeah, no, it seems like it's a very short-term solution for an ongoing and very long-term problem. And I don't diminish the complexity of this at all. I don't pretend there's an easy answer, but it does seem that we are turning to kind of, tried and true solutions, which is, launch some cruise missiles at them and hope things get a little better for a while.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. Maybe I'll check in with you down the road and see how things are going.
All right.
We appreciate you giving us your time and your expertise on this very complicated matter.
Very glad to. Thank you, David.